All right. So, welcome to How to Write a Performance F. In this lecture, I'm just going to be talking about sort of the history of performance apps, right? The significance to them, where they came from, how they progressed, the parts of writing a performance 1AC, more particularly the different parts to answer T and CAP, because those are like the main arguments read against performance apps, how to write an overview in the 1AR, and how to strategically use performance apps. So first, starting off with the history of performance debate, there's a question.
I think I may be in the wrong elective. Do you know where?
I didn't see you on the sign-in sheet.
Yeah. Do you know where truth testing and comparative worlds is?
So if you go to the sign-up sheet, that's in this lab room.
It directed me to here.
It should.
Yeah.
All right, how about trying it again? Because I think it might have been a problem with this lab room just starting, possibly.
Okay.
Yeah, I would try it again.
Okay, I'll leave. Thank you.
No problem. Have fun.
Yeah.
All right. So performance apps really started with the rise of urban debate leagues. And the reason why is because debate was predominantly and historically a majority like white male environment. And this activity was really created in order for those people, right, those privileged white men, to be able to debate about government actions and policy options that would be, good to implement hypothetically. So with the rise of urban debate leagues, it increased Black and Brown participation in debate and integrated them into this majority white environment. And this highly academic and structured activity required a certain style. And white success sort of maintains that structure because it necessitated rigorous research, a formal presentation of the information, and those teams had years of back files that put them ahead in the debate space, right? And so these were sort of like big schools that had the privilege of accessing tons of research and credible, like quote unquote, credible, qualified academics, right? And so the main sort of school that started with a framework for performance debate was the Louisville school, which was a collegiate team. And they started something called the Louisville Project. And who here, you could just like say I, if you've heard of the Louisville Project.
Me.
I did.
2 people, 3 people. So yeah, the Louisville Project was a sort of like groundbreaking moment in debate because it changed the way, the style, right, and the approach to debate. And so one thing that was like another common example from the Louisville Project that some of you may have heard of was when they would bring in debate, like they would bring in regular people from outside of the tournament into their rounds to ask them their opinion of debate. Like, what do you think of this topic at hand, right? How do you feel about it, right? Because again, debate was about qualified and credible opinions, but they brought in the perspective of those who had nothing to do with debate in order to get their opinion, right? Which wasn't normal at that time. So they had 3 tiers to the Louisville Project. And the 3 tiers consisted of personal experience, organic intellectualism, and traditional academic knowledge. So let's break that down further. Personal experience is how they related, or how you as the debater relates to the content at hand, right? What is your relationship to the topic? Is it something you witnessed before, something that has affected you in some way? And what is your overall relationship to the given topic? Next is organic intellectualism. This is applying the sort of perspective of a certain community to the topic at hand, right? So what is the community's perspective of the topic, right? What is the aggrieved community's reflection of it? And how does the community seek to push back against those structures? So that's organic intellectualism, taking sort of the topic at hand and applying knowledge from the community or certain different, perspectives and applying that to the topic. And the last part is traditional academic knowledge, because these debaters didn't just, refuse all, academic texts, but rather they incorporated that into their experience and the experience of the community. So again, this is using books and literature that explains the world around you, and those regular academic opinions. So yeah, any questions so far on the Louisville project, who they were, what they were about? Any questions of the 3-tier process? Okay, cool. So if there's no questions, I'm gonna move on. So let's think about how to use these 3 tiers strategically in creating your 1AC, and how to create the different layers in order to use them, in order to like actually use the layers in debate. So let's break down the 3 tiers even more. So there's 3 questions you should sort of be asking yourself when writing a performance app. And the 3 questions are, how is this AF method good for me? How is it good for the debate community? And how is it good for the world writ large? Okay, and those are the 3 layers you should be using to write your performance 1AC. How is it good for the self, the debate community, the world? Okay, and there is a strategic reason and an also like sort of performative reason why those 3 layers are necessary. First is it provides a really good storyline to the 1AC, right? And it's not just, it adds depth to the 1AC, right? And strategically, it's good because if a debater concedes any one of those 3 layers, you can leverage it to win the debate, right? By collapsing to one of the 3 layers and doing impact weighing as to why you should prefer that over the negatives arguments, okay? And so there should sort of be a balance between all 3 things, or else your radical liberatory potential becomes rootless, right? And so you want to make sure that each of those things are in there. And so I'll give some examples. So for how is it good for the self is how do you benefit from the advocacy? If my argument and my method is using sort of poetry to rewrite the style of debate and create an inclusive space, because the USFG has historically been harmful, then I would say it's good for me because as an artistic expression and as an expression of the self, then it's one that is sort of liberatory because it frees me from the obligation of having to defend a sort of harmful structure, right? And so it would benefit me because of, and it sort of gives you ethos, right? Because you're able to provide that emotion, that sort of ethics into your speech. How is it good for the debate space is how can the activity benefit from your method, right? So for example, the Louisville debaters helped change the activity by refusing to play the game of debate as traditionally played, which introduced alternative styles of education. This space and the debate space writ large is unique because it is a platform to voice these issues. So how can your advocacy ask this platform and make it more accessible, right? Because a lot of the times, and especially with T debaters, they'll make the argument that debate is a game, right? How many people have heard the argument that debate is a game? Or can explain to me what it means? All right, so who can explain to me what it means for debate to be a game? You could just, yeah.
It's just like they use a debate as a game, and that it's all about like competitive activity, fairness, and things like that. Like it's basically just about winning and losing and making it fair to do so.
Exactly. Like they say that the point of debate being a game is like competitive equity and each side having a 50-50 chance to win, but that's not always the case, right? Like people assume that we come to debate just to talk about debate, go back to our schools and our communities, and that's the end of debate, right? But it's like, no, like these conversations carry over, they spill over, like we bring them back to our communities. We talk to our friends and teachers about these things. Like our debate coaches hear all about our rounds right after it ended, right? As soon as the lights turn off, we push in our chairs, we close the doors, we say good debate and have a good day and get the RFD. It's like, that's not the end, right? Like debate isn't just something you can turn off and walk away from. It's a part of our lives, like our everyday lives. Like I've used parts of debate in school, like a lot, almost like all the time, right? And so it's like, people who say debate is a game doesn't understand how our conversations can change the activity. And I'll give you a really good example, right? So like after Devon and Nicole, which was a team from Rutgers, united the crowns for the second time. This was the first Black woman Nicole was the first Black woman to ever unite the crowns, right? After that, Black women participation increased at the end of the national debate tournament, almost by 4 times, right? Because there was a Black woman in um, every quarters round at the NDT the year after that, right? And so to say that debate doesn't have an impact on the community is almost just a flat out lie, right? Because it changes the way people approach the activity. So how is your method, right, good for the space at hand? And then third is, how is it good for the world, right? And this is like your normative solvency. Is like, how can your method be used outside of this space, in certain communities, in, the real world, right? And what impacts does that resolve? So does that make sense so far? Is the 3 layers of writing the actual 1AC? Cool. All right, there's no questions, then I'll talk about that a little bit more. The last thing is framing, right? Because with each theory comes its own sort of perspective of the world, right? And we call this a theory of power. And a theory of power is just explaining where impacts and sort of, what matters stems from. So if you're a CAP debater, right, or if you read the CAP K, then the AF will say that, we should dismantle capitalism because it is a unstable system that causes exploitation and creates, certain urban, environments to be policed more because of under resources, et cetera, right? And so that would be their theory of powers. Capitalism is the root of all evil. If you're reading like a PES-AF, right, you would say ontology is what structures the world, and the middle passage is what allowed the system of capitalism to be created and is what allows sort of desires and antagonisms to harm Black people, right? If you are reading a FemIR-AF, for example, right, your theory of power would be that women are excluded in certain spheres of life, right? So the domestic sphere and the political sphere, right? Conversations about secondary sanctions never include those women because they're seen as a male-oriented space, right? When in reality, women have been large portions of, the political sphere, right? So yeah, theory of powers, and then getting into the actual 3 layers. Now, let's also talk about solvency for a second, because solvency isn't always the same for performance apps, right? And this conversation of sort of fiat. Regular policy apps will say that fiat is necessary because, again, it allows fair discussions, right? If there were always conversations of would the plan be passed, there would never be conversations about the benefits or cost of it being passed. And so this notion of fiat assumes that we are always talking about a hypothetical implementation outside of debate. Performances completely rewrite that, right? Performances say no. Instead of talking about this future sort of space, this hypothetical implementation, let's talk about the here and now, right? And that's sort of a lot of role of the ballots that reframe the debate, because it's no longer about the ballot being given to a debater who can solve some external harm outside of the space, right? Some random governmental impact, but rather is applied to impacts in the debate space. And of course, one individual performance will not or may not solve every impact, right, or solve the entirety of the problem, but it is a mitigatory process, and more importantly, is a process, period, right? And this process is important because it sets norms, right? It sets its own precedent that says that if there is a harm in the debate space, it should be getting rid of, or there should be an accountability metric put in place, right? And so this deals with fiat differently because it says that we should deal with harms that debaters actually experience, things that people actually have to go through, because that is worth talking about. And the conversations that can lead to is net better than hypothetical conversations, because we know that it has actual accountability for people who are really experiencing it, right? So like, what is the point of talking about nuclear war, right? Some far off big stick impact when people are actually experiencing like racism in the debate space, right? And so that's sort of the part of performances that people sort of miss out, is the fact that like these conversations go farther than political conversations, right? Or conversations solely about the USFG. So yeah, So solvency doesn't always have to be, a method that can resolve all of the entirety of a problem, but can be a process towards getting rid of a problem, right? Okay. So now let's talk about um, sort of the actual app construction. So like we have the ideas in mind, right? We have our layers in mind. We have our sort of use of the theory of power in mind. Now let's talk about actually constructing the 1AC. So when you're actually going into writing the 1AC, right, and you're like, you have, your literature base, right, whether it be about race, class, gender, um, sexuality, et cetera. Now let's talk about, formulating that into 1AC. So you want to start backwards, okay? You want to start with the 2AR. Don't think about trying to fit all these cards in the 1AC because at that point you'll just be lost towards the goal of the 1AC. So start backwards. What are the harms that you are trying to resolve? What is your method to resolve that? And what performative elements are you going to be incorporating into your 1AC, right? Will you have poetry? Will you be playing music? Will you not be reading any cards? Is there like a portion where it's solely silent in the 1AC, right? And talk about the benefits of that, okay? And so once you have that written down, right, you have your impact, you have your solvency, you have your performative elements, you have your like framing or roll of the ballot, then it'll make it easier to put the 1AC together because you have the goal in mind when creating the 1AC. It also allows you to be a lot more strategic in how you write your 1AC. And I'll talk about that further. So it makes you strategic because you want to have embedded clash in the actual app, right? So have a card that has an answer written into it to answer topicality and capitalism, right? And so many times, like literature bases will have answers already embedded in. So for example, like if you're reading an app about Afro-pessimism, right? It'll have a sort of conversation about capitalism already written in it. And so you just need to extrapolate in the 1AR how that card applies to the cap game. Or for example, some framing cards, right, will have answers to topicality or like unilateral modes of education. Cross apply that card to topicality, right? But the thing is, it'll be hard for the negative to sort of, see that coming because it's embedded in the performance. So have some sort of embedded clash. That way you can preempt arguments and just cross apply quick arguments in the 1AR and it takes up less time. Next, next is actually writing out and choosing what music you want to play and what the narrative will say, right? And you want to have, again, embedded clash in that as well. So will your music have an answer to T or cap? Will your narrative include, like implicit impact turns to T or cap? And doing that is, again, a strategic value to the performance. Next is it should tell a general cohesive story, right? So it should have a thesis. Your app should have a thesis that you maintain throughout the entirety of the debate. And more specifically is there should be a cohesive language that you're using, right? So if your 1AC is full of language about why racism or sexism is bad in the debate space, then use that language to answer T and cap and make sure that language makes it to the 2AR. And the reason why I'm adding emphasis to this, this notion of language is because judges want to see your story being brought from the 1AC to the 2AR, right? We want to see answers in the 2AR that will remind us of the 1AC because the app starts and ends the debate. So you don't want us to lose the app at all, right? So make sure you're incorporated in every instance in every speech. So this will mean maybe use the same one line that you have in the app in the 1 and 2AR overview, or use the same idea, in the next speeches. And last is have at least 5 ways to win the debate in the 1AC. So when you're writing the 1AC, there should be 5 reasons to vote at. So this can be 3 impacts, right? 3 impacts from the 1AC. It can be a framing argument, and it can be a performative element, right? So like vote off the music because of X, Y, and Z. There are 3 impacts this resolves, which are each net benefits to the 1AC, and then vote on our framing because it is a different view of the world and should be preferred on face because of X, Y, and Z, right? However, you don't want 5 reasons to vote app in the 2AR because that'll be too much and you'll just spread yourself thin. So you want to start to collapse. In the 1AR, have 3 reasons. So maybe you have 2 impacts and a performative element. Or maybe you have 1 impact, 1 performative element, and the framing reasons to vote app, right? As long as there's 3 reasons to vote app in the 1AR. Last, in the 2AR, have 1 out, right? Maybe it's just a performative element, or maybe they've conceded an impact that you resolve and prove why that impact outweighs the rest of the debate, right? And so you want to collapse, and you should have a 5-3-1 sort of flow. Next is judge instruction. So you understand how your AF works, right? But the judge may be sort of lost in the 1AC, or maybe they're just, sort of confused of what's going on. So what you want to do is give judge instruction. Tell the judge how to evaluate the round. Maybe the round isn't about, fairness, but they should be a critical educator who views the round through creating access, right? And access is the terminal impact of the round and not, sort of fairness. Because even if fairness matters, if people aren't there to even be a part of the game, what is the point of the game in the first place, right? If people aren't even in the space, right? So judge instruction is really important, and this can like look like a rule of the judge, or when you're giving your arguments have implications. So like if I win X, this means you should think about the debate as Y, and it wins us the debate because of Z. Okay, so having that judge instruction is important. So walk the judge through your thinking and frame the debate towards your benefit. Next is sort of impact framing, because you're gonna have impacts that matter more than T, right? And the thing about T debates is sometimes it becomes a yes/no question, and debaters don't do the extra step to prove why, if you win your argument, why that should be preferred or why it wins you the debate. So have that impact frame, right? So if we win access, right, as a terminal impact, that means that controls the internal link to every other impact they're going for, right? Only we prove we create more access, which means only we are going to win the debate. All right. So any questions so far on the app construction? Any questions? Okay. So now let's talk about the 1AR. So starting with an overview. So when you get to the 1AR, first and foremost, your roadmap should always start with the app. Even if they read T, start with the app, because the app is what you are going to be winning. Start with what you're winning, right? And you're going to be winning the app. So you want to extend the app in this order. You want to start with extending the thesis, right? So what is, again, your general summary of the app, right? Your theory of power, and extend the general thesis, right? Next is the harm. What are the impacts coming from the app? So like, capitalism is an unsustainable system, right? This topic is tied into capitalism because of X, Y, and Z, and there are 3 impacts, right? And explain what those harms or impacts are, and then explain the solvency. What is your method to resolve? So like, again, going back to this cap example, our advocacy is a like Marxist historical analysis, and we need to analyze how cap is invested in certain conversations and certain dialogues, and those should be like refused, right? So what is your solvency? And then last is your framing, right? And this is like your role of the judge, role of the ballot, and why your role of the ballot / judge should be preferred, okay? And the thing about performance apps and like the benefit to it is being able to spin your arguments, right? And when I say spin, I mean allowing yourself to be ahead of negative offense. So the negative is going to be like, so for example, one common thing is like, debaters will read optimism on the like Afro optimism on the app, right? And on case in the 1NC, the negative will be like fatalism is bad because if you constantly think of yourself as an object, that's bad. But it's like if you're reading optimism, you don't see yourself in a constant state of objectivity. You see yourself as creating like unique modes of social life, right? And so like if you can recontextualize your act to be like they've misunderstood the point of the act. We are not fatalism, but rather we view ourselves as having an overflowing of sociality, an overflowing of life, right? Which means that offense no longer applies, and it proves why their model of debate is bad, right? Because if you can conflate arguments to say that they're all one thing, right? They're all pessimism, then it proves why your model of debate never encourages actual engagement with certain apps. So that's what I mean by recontextualizing and spinning the app, right? So like if they misunderstand and read the wrong offense, for example, against your app, then you can re-explain what it means to get out of their offense. And the overview should be no longer than a minute, right? Probably around 45 seconds, no longer than a minute, because you want to get to the line by line. Or if you are going to do a minute, or like maybe even a little bit more than a minute, make sure that there's implicit clash, right? So like extend this one contention, right, or this one advantage. This is also an impact turn to T, and it also proves our permutation on cat. Extend our second advantage. This is also a impact turn to their sort of like impact that extinction is going to happen, because extinction is post-fiat. We think fiat is illusory, which means prefer our impact, which is happening right now, right, in the here and now, right? So that's what I mean by implicit clash, having that sort of argument already embedded in the extension of the app. So now let's talk about more explicitly dealing with, or does that make sense so far, the overview section? Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
How, like, specifically would you be able to extend, like, not only the impacts of your performance, but maybe include, like the actual, like, content of your performance? So say I choose to, like, play a song or, like, read a poem or something. Would it be, like, wise to include, like, actual, like, lyrics of the song, almost as if they're, like, tags of a card or something?
Yes, yeah, like literally, like bring in the lines that people like that they were singing or saying, and like write it out and put it and make it a part of your speech. So I would be like, so like one thing that I did is we had like a sound clip in one of our apps, and what we'd do is we'd put like a quote from the sound clip, then we'll go right into our argument. And the reason why this is beneficial is because, again, it reminds the judge of the 1AC, and it adds that packaging to your argument. So yeah, I would make it like literally a tag. Any other questions?
I have a question, like adding to that. So
Yeah.
could you also make the tag like in a different language if you're doing like an identity performance, kind of like I say it in Spanish instead of in English?
Yeah, definitely. And then, so yeah, of course you can. Like, I would, I think that is good as long as, again, you can give the judge instruction, right? So I would do it in a different language, but then tell the judge, right, if you can't understand it, right, then it proves our point. Or like, if you are uncomfortable, that proves our point, right, as to why it is necessary. So yeah, you can definitely do a different language. You can add literal quotes from the lyrics, or like literal lyrics from the music. You can reread lines from the 1AC. And this is like, especially like, it provides a lot of ethos and pathos, especially when you're doing it against like T and Cap, right? Because if your argument is that, in the debate space currently, there is like, say, just like exclusive norms, right, in general, then on T, adding those lyrics will make it seem like T just adds to those exclusive norms, which it kind of does, right? But yeah, definitely you can do those things. Any other questions? All right, cool. So dealing with T. So let's talk about what T is first and foremost, right? Topicality is the negative saying. So first, we need to know what burdens are, right? So the burdens af or the af the burden of the AF, I'm sorry, the burden of the AF is to prove a net beneficial shift from the status quo, right? So the AF has to prove that they can implement some plan that can solve some harm that is not happening currently in the status quo, right? So like eliminating secondary sanctions is good because it allows Iran to get medical supplies, which will then solve like or help them deal with COVID, right? So that's like a net beneficial shift from the status quo. The negatives burden is the burden of rejoinder. And rejoinder just means that they have to respond, right? The only thing that the negative has to do is respond to the AF and prove some sort of cost. Topicality says that the negative cannot meet their burden of rejoinder because they do not have the ability to respond to the AF, right? Because if the AF is like some discussion about why Coca-Cola is more sugary than Pepsi, and the topic is removing secondary sanctions, the negative has no way to respond to the AF. And just because the AF can prove that Coca-Cola is more sugary doesn't mean they can win the debate, right? And so that's what T says. But the reason why this is problematic is because T attempts to privilege certain conversations over the other, right? And the AF, and so they say, and so the first, who can tell me what the first part of T is? You can just say what it is.
Like the inter?
Yep, the interpretation, right? And so the interpretation is a model that they set forward for the debate community. And they say in our model, debaters should only discuss the resolution, right? And the negative can read some dissad or some competing policy options such as a counter plan or critique, right? And so that's what an interpretation is, a model. But the 1AC has already set an interpretation for the debate, right? And so why is there a need to set a counter insert, right? Why is it that when we respond to an insert, performance debaters say counter interpretation? If there was already an insert starting from the 1AC, right? So you need to prove why the conversations that stem from your interpretation, right? That stem from your theory of power, that stem from your view of the world is net beneficial than the conversations of solely government action, right? What is the point of talking about this same topic every single debate where policy debaters can read the same dissad, the same counter plan, and read the same generic block that they have for every debate, right? What usefulness is that, right? What does that provide to the debate space other than creating stale arguments, right? And so that's sort of how you should be thinking about it, is your AF provides some unique insight into the debate space that cannot be brought from, solely talking about government action, especially when some debaters don't even have the privilege to talk about that because they are excluded, right? Because they are forced to leave the activity because it's so harmful, right? So that's sort of how you should be thinking about T. When actually responding to it, you want to have a quote unquote counter insert, even though you've set an interpretation, right? But you want to have a model for what debates would look like in your world. So if debaters don't have to talk about the topic all the time, then maybe it will be net beneficial to use the topic as a springboard to different conversations. So for example, instead of talking about how the USFG can remove sanctions, let's rather talk about how sanctions are tied to a broader history of the slave trade, right? Or a broader history of hegemony, right? And how that history, right, of slavery is tied into the debate space now, right? How there are effects that we can see now, right? We have a judge, right? Like, doesn't that remind you of like sort of the criminal justice system and how we need white people to evaluate and sort of give validation to our performances, right? And so just talk about like how your model of debate leads to different conversations or net beneficial conversations, right? And so you also want to have those standards in there. So 2 to 3 net benefits as to why we should prefer your interpretation. The same way T debaters are like limits, ground, clash. You want to have like revolutionary education. You want to have like arguments or like standards about creating revolutionary education, maybe creating unique methods to resolve certain harms, and yeah, just like different standards like that. Next is having voters, right? The same way T debaters say impact, education and fairness, you want to have a terminal impact to like access, or you want to have an impact to like education, but a terminal impact to access, right? Because again, if debaters don't have access to this space, then how do we get the benefits that the negative is talking about, right? So that controls the internal link to the T shell writ large. So that proves a prerequisite claim for the act, okay? Does that make sense? Having a prerequisite claim, proving that you control the internal link to T? Or are there any questions? Okay, cool. So now let's talk about the actual standards and how to actually answer the specific standards of fairness, right? So like you have your own counter interpretation, you have your standards, you have your voters, and you've basically laid out what your model of debate would look like given the conversation of the 1AC, right? So now let's talk about answering T. So the two main ways to deal with answering their standards and their voters are impact turns and link turns, right? But you don't want to impact turn and link turn the same standard, right? Or the same voter, because that will double turn you, right? So let's talk about what that would look like. Impact turning T would look like one, the implicit clash that you have from the 1AC, right? So if I cross apply an argument that says, in the world, there are structural barriers to women trying to have conversations of policies, that is an impact, that is my conversation of barriers in the world. However, that can also be used to impact turn T, because T has that same function of excluding women from talking about sort of the problems they experience, because you'd rather have these masculine discussions of secondary sanctions, right? So T replicates the same biases of the world, and T as a off case is bad because it attempts to limit our education, right? So that would be an impact turn to T, right? T as a strategy, T as an off case is bad because of X, Y, and Z, is exclusive because of X, Y, and Z, and has these impacts, right? Next is impact turning standards. So for example, if they say clash is good because clash leads to more in-depth debates about policies and allows us to get more education because we can talk about the government, blah, 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 right? You want to impact turn clash and be like, no, you not being able to clash is good because it proves that there's only a strategic incentive to engage debates and not a incentive to change anything, right? You'd rather get a technical concession and win the debate rather than actually engaging in the performance of the AF, and trying to have a conversation, right? Trying to have a dialogue that can do more than just win a debate, but rather change the debate space, right? So that's an impact, that would be an impact turn. Then an impact turn to a voter would be like impact turning fairness and proving that fairness doesn't exist. Fairness attempts to maintain privileged debates for like white people, et cetera, right? And what the impact of that would be. So that would be that's an example of impact turning. So impact turning T as a strategy, impact turning the interpretation, impact turning the standards, and impact turning the voters. Next are link turns. And link turns more so work on standards that rely on education and then education as a voter, right? And so what this would look like is you proving that the app is net better for education, right? One, because we provide new perspectives, we allow new literature fields, we force conversations that are uncomfortable for you, which will make you grow and change your sort of mindset. And these have real, again, right? Debate is not solely a game that we can talk about these things and leave it in the game, but we can use it in our real life, right? Take it back to our communities, educate the people around us, educate and create new perspectives, which will have material implications later in our lives when we have jobs, because we can use the knowledge we've learned and the conversations we have to break down biases in the real world, right? So does that make sense so far to everybody answering T, or are there any questions? Good. All right. So now let's move on to talking about answering the K. So the reason why the CAP-K is so prevalent against performance apps are because performance apps are seen as something you as the one debater do that and it's only about your feelings, and it's only about sort of like your just like mindset of the world, right? This is why the main sort of links to the CAP critique are links that are like, you are individualistic, right? You only care about yourself, which means that you don't care about the social like the concrete conditions around you. You only care about how you're feeling that particular day. They'll say that again, you're abstract, right? Like your music doesn't do anything because it makes you like, it's like a moment of catharsis that doesn't change anything. It just makes you feel good in the moment, but doesn't change the overall structure of capitalism. They'll read links that are like, you know, the critiques or like links that are just like, the signs and the semiotics of the 1AC are bad because it facilitates and adds more value to capitalism, right? And then they'll say the impact is like extinction, because if you continue to add value and continue to participate in a capitalistic system, then you continue the under-resourcing of people, you continue the exploitation of people, and you will cause like overall climate change and extinction in the future, right? So let's talk about that, right? 9 times out of 10, right, you are not individualistic, right? And even if you are, you can impact certain why being individualistic is good. But you rely on the community, right? Debate wouldn't be what it is without a community, right? And so one of the main strategies are link turns and perms on the critique, right? So you want to prove that the app isn't individualistic, but rather relies on a community, which would link turn that, first link. And then you can link turn you not being material, right? People assume that music is this, thing that people do just to listen to music, right? Just to, take time off their hands. But in reality, music is radical, right? Like a lot of music talks about prevalent social issues, right? Like they talk about things that are going on in their communities, and they express it in a sort of affective way that is necessary or almost effective in creating change, right? People feel energized and able to, create change when they listen to music. So it's not abstract, but rather it's necessary to fuel the material change you say needs to happen, right? And the reason why I say these link turns should be combined with a permutation is because you can go for perm to the aft and the neg, right? We need affect first in order to influence material change, or we need an individual moment of reprieve in order to create a communal moment of change, right? And so that's how the permutation would function. Or you could be like, perm do both, right? We can do abstract performances and material change at the same time, right? Nothing is stopping those things from happening. And one like really good example is Black Lives Matter protests need to envision a world in which Black Lives Matter in order for them to go out and protest, right? In order for them to actually create that change. So that imagination, that envisioning of a different world is good, right? Next is impact comparison, right? So their impact is that hypothetical impact that's like extinction, something that will happen far off in the future, versus your impact that is happening right now. So you want to do impact calculus that proves that your impacts matter way more than their impacts in the future. Because again, fiat's illusory, right? These impacts are happening now. So the longer we wait to solve it, the more it'll be intensified, et cetera, et cetera. And then prove why your role of the ballot should be preferred over their role of the ballot, right? So does this make sense so far for everybody?
Yes.
Okay, are there any questions? Because time is beginning to run out. Okay, if there are no questions, then have you all heard of F Postal?
Yeah, but I kind of don't know what it stands for.
Okay, that's good. All right, so there's a thumbs up. Okay, well, I'm just gonna go. Since there's like extra time, I'll just go over F postal again, except through the performative analytic, right? So F postal is sort of my like just acronym to answer critiques, and it's just the structure that you can follow to make it easier to answer critiques, right? So first is framing. What is your why should we prefer your framing compared to the negatives, right? And what I mean by this is how does your theory of power sort of compare to, say, for example, capitalism, right? So maybe you already take into account a theory of capitalism. Like one app I've seen on this topic is, you know, the Wakework app that ties secondary sanctions to financialization, right? So like you are already thinking about how to break down capitalism because bodies are tied to this process of capitalism, right? Black people were bought and sold in the system of capitalism. So to be against anti-Blackness is to inherently be against to be against capitalism, right? So that's sort of your framing, is that we should prefer resisting anti-Blackness because one, it is an umbrella effect, which also encapsulates taking down capitalism, and two, is that anti-Blackness influences how capitalism functions, right? Or like to be against, or to have like a fem aff, right, is to be against capitalism because of like the wage gap, for example, right? So that's like your framing, right? Is how your theory of power compares to theirs. Next is the permutation. And the permutation is how the aff and the negative can happen in any combination, right? And again, I already went over why this is important is because one, you can prove that you solved the links through like link turns, and it also means that it takes away competition, right? So the reason why perms are good is because it proves that there is no competition between the aff and the neg. If you prove that there is no competition between the aff and the neg, it means the judge does not have to have a forced decision between one of the two, but rather can vote for the aff for like the combination of the two, right? There's nothing stopping both of them from happening at the same time. So that's why permutations are strategic. Next is offense, right? So offense slash impact weighing, right? And so can you win a general dissad to the alternative, for example, right? So if the alternative is, say, for example, a general strike, right? If the alternative is a general strike against capitalism, everybody should leave their jobs and form, unions to fight back against the bosses, right? Can you think of like a general dissat to that, right? Maybe those unions form the same racist coalitions that the workspace embodied, right? Or maybe the same racist mindsets that the world embodies, right? So that would be like an offensive argument to make against it. Or maybe like whenever there is a general strike, such as the MOVE program, they are bombed, right? So like the MOVE program were a group of Black people who created this group to fight back against capitalism. They were anti-capitalist, but they like were literally bombed, right? And so that's a dissad to the alternative of general strikes and those forms of coalitions, is because they will be pathologized and weaponized against. So that's offense. And then impact calculus, which is what I was sort of talking about earlier. Next is solvency deficit, right? And this means the alternative cannot solve the aff. So the alt of a general strike or the alt of a historical Marxist analysis cannot resolve the anti-Blackness of the aff or the anti-femininity of the aff, right? So that's just solvency deficit means that you should prefer or err aff solvency, try or die, right? Next is a theoretical objection, right? So this can look like condo is bad, right? Vague alt's bad. Any sort of theoretical objection that will force a response from the 2NR, right? Because this is a procedural argument. If they don't answer it, then it's GG. Like it's a route to the ballot, and it's an easy way to win a procedural, to take out all the substance of the case. And it doesn't have to be a whole shell, right? You could just be like, vague alt's bad because of X, Y, and Z. The impact is fairness because of X, Y, and Z, and then move on, right? Next is an alternative deficit. This means the alternative cannot solve their own impacts, right? Which would grant a net benefit to the perm, right? Or an extra reason to prefer the perm, right? So a general strike can't even solve extinction, right? Historical Marxist analysis can't solve extinction, and that would be an alternative deficit. And last is a link turn / no link, okay? So winning a no link is necessary to win a link turn, because you need to prove that, one, it doesn't apply to this specific app, right, or your specific method, right, because a lot of times it'll be general, and two, you actually solve it, right? So not only does it not apply for you, the impact that they say it stems from you, you solve it, right? So going back to the example of like individualism, not only does the app rely on a community, right, for example, for some reason, but you also solve this individualistic mindset because um, it requires an entire group of people to think a certain way in order to create the change, right? So again, in order to have a Black Lives Matter protest, you need everybody to think Black Lives Matter and envision that world in order to go out there and protest for it, because we currently live in a world where it doesn't. So does that make sense so far? Or are there any like general questions before we end? This is like the quietest group in the world.
I guess I have a question of like, what's like the general rule when it comes to like playing music in performance apps? Like when it comes to like language, like are we allowed, like if I were to play like some Kendrick Lamar?
It's some Kendrick Lamar.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, like, I mean, honestly, so language doesn't matter, I think, as long as you're not going against some like novice that like has no idea what's going on. I don't think, you know, language really matters. And I think Kendrick is like explicit in the conditions that he talks about, right? Because he's like, I think he's real about what he talks about. So I don't think that there's any problem as long as, you know, as long as it isn't problematic, like the you know, like in general, as long as the lyrics aren't problematic and or demeaning in any way, then I think you'll be good, because that'll just open you up to offense from the negative, to be like, you know, this lyric is problematic, which means your method is problematic. So that's just something to watch out for. Another general tip is like, make sure that you also have like a portion in the 1AC. You don't want to play music the entire 6 minutes, and make sure that you can use that music in the 1 and 2 AR, right? Use it as offense.
Right. And then also I kind of have a question about like embodiment, because that happens a lot through performance apps.
Yeah,
So how would you like embody like a song, and like how would that kind of work? Because I know like you can embody like authors and like their methodologies, but like if I were to play like some like, I don't know, what's her name, the girl who, I forgot her name, but yeah, if I were to embody like an artist, like what would that look like?
Wait, what girl?
Janelle Monáe.
Oh yes, play some Janelle Monáe, play some Lizzo, all of that.
Absolutely.
Yes. I forgot the question. I'm sorry.
What would embodiment
Yeah,
look
embodying
like?
it. So it could look like two things, right? It could look like one, you know, sort of like, so like I'm thinking about it like, one is embodying music is also like using music again as an energizing effect, right? And as an affective mode of expression that motivates people to want to care about things, right? So like that could be like one way to embody it, is like a motivating argument, but also is using the lyrics to prove why it explains certain conditions, right? So like Janelle Monáe, and we were playing one of her, I think we were playing a song like that in our app, and there's a line that says, you know, she's like, I'm not, you know, I'm not a singular expression, right? Like sometimes I'm fact, sometimes I'm fiction, right? And we just use that as a way to explain what it means to become, right? What does it mean to be, right? Being isn't just a static notion. Sometimes you're like the high note, sometimes you're the low note, right? But like those things change, right? We live in a state of fluctuating, right? We're not in a static state of being, right? But like, yeah, just like embodiment, I think embodiment is it is what you make it, if that makes sense, right? Because you can relate to a lyric and say that lyric is sort of how you're feeling and is what motivates you to talk about those things in the first place. Or you can say, in general, music as a political method is necessary to create relationality between people.
Mhm. And then can't you also like use your embodiment as like offense or like I guess like defense, but like you can say like the neg doesn't get any access to like the perm because they don't do the specific action of the 1AC, and like embodiment is good, and the neg has already performed the 1NC without embodiment, so they can't like get like any like disads, or not disads, but like they can't try to like adopt what I've done.
So I think that would be good if you're reading like a negative, a performance on the negative, right? Because that
Mhm.
way that perm argument will apply. So you'll be like, they already read a policy act, which means their perm would make no sense because of our performance, right? They engage in the same stale policy options that everybody else does in every other debate that's going on right now. So they don't get that access to the perm. But on the app, I would make that argument if they say, um, I would make that argument as an impact term, right? So I would
Mhm.
like prefer the app because they engage in the same stale debates as everybody else, whereas we are like coming with a different style, right? And this style is necessary because it creates an inclusive space for those who don't want to only read performance or only want to read policy apps.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question. Like, okay, so what are the limits to performance? What are we not allowed to do?
See, I think you just asked the wrong person because I honestly don't think there are limits as long as you're not being problematic, right? Because and problematic as being like blatantly offensive, right? That's what I mean by problematic. But like I've seen a lot of things, right? I've seen people dance, I've seen people sing, I've seen people not say anything at all. I've seen people do like cultural sort of expressions, right? I've seen people do read a whole app in a different language. Um, uh, I've seen people who are like really just like explicit in their language because they were talking about sort of like nuclear bombs relation to like sexuality and gender. Um, so like again, like there is almost no limit, right? It's again what you make it as long as you aren't infringing on other people's sort of like sovereignty, right? As long as you're not like calling people like as long as you're not like I've seen people like roast other people. Like there really is no limit as long as you know there's as long as there's a framing that justifies why you're doing what you're doing, right? And there are like net benefits to it. I think that's the basis for performances.
How do you answer just general disads to performance, like people saying performance is bad or it's inaccessible?
Well, performances definitely aren't inaccessible insofar as everybody pretty much performs, right? Like negative getting up and reading their T-show is a performance. It's a pretty bad performance, but it's a performance. Um, and so I think general answers are so okay, I got you. So like one main argument is people will say affect is bad because affect is um, like individual affect doesn't like create real change. I would make arguments as to why performances create the internal link to material change, right? Or performances are what create new perspectives of the world. Because if we continue to think about debate as a yes no question, or if we continue to think about the world as white and black, right? And not quite literally, but then that would mean that we'll never allow new education, or we'll never allow new mindsets. We'll never allow, and if we don't allow new mindsets, white people, for example, will continue to grow up thinking racistly, right? Or like those who grew up in like patriarchal conditions will grow up to be patriarchs, right? So there needs to be an ability to break down these biases that can only happen through, you know, embodied performances, right? So if I were answering general like performance bad arguments, I would make arguments as to why it's accessible, it is revolutionary in terms of education and in terms of what it can change, and uh, it's like liberatory, right? It's definitely liberatory. But, did that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
No problem.
Regarding like online debate and like the situation we are in now, do you have any ideas of thoughts or how to like use performance debate?
Yeah, so definitely. I think actually online debate adds a lot of different things that you can do, right? Because one thing is you can maybe turn off your camera, right, as a performance, right? That could be an argument. Maybe you could like put a colored tape across, right, and that'll be a performance, and have like the screen and like have like yeah, if there's like colored clear tape, then you'll see me as like blue or red or purple or green or yellow or something. You could put like I have a bottle. You could put like a bottle in front of or like a plastic bottle in front of it, and it'll create like a fisheye effect. But I think that you can do like different things like that in terms of music with online debate. Share your screen, and I think if you share your screen, the music will also play through the screen. So that way, because for example, if I were to play music right now and try to talk, one of the two will get cut off, either my voice or the music. So it won't be too great. But I think if you share your screen and play it off of like the music off your laptop, it'll play well, and your voice will sound good over it as well. And yeah, just do creative things like that, right? Like play with the camera, play with the sound, um, and like it's really like you can terraform the entire space, right? Because we're not like in the real world, we're virtual now, and that could be an argument. Maybe you can make an argument as to why none of this is real, right? Like this is like perfect time for Boji debaters to be like, yeah, like we're in an actual simulation right now. But yeah, just play around with things like that. Any other last questions before we head off to lab? And if there aren't, feel free to email me throughout the day with anything that pops up, any other general questions. But I hope this helped, and I hope you learned something new. Have a good day.
Thank
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. No problem.
Thank you.
No problem.